Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So I've noticed recently there has been a trend towards multi-layered stencils. So these are stencils that you layer on top of each other to get one beautiful detailed image. I want to show you how to use these stencils and how to create beautiful layers. But more importantly, what if you have a lot of stencils in your stash and you want to do something similar? Today I'm going to show you basically how you can use really any stencil that you have to create beautiful layered images in your projects. So my favorite of these layering stencils are the All-to-New Golden Days stencil. And so what this one is basically a Peony that has 4 different stencils in the one set. So first of all, you have the stencil that's basically the outline. Then you have one with a number 2 on it, and that would add more detail. You have a third layer that's going to add even more detail to your subject. And then you have the fourth. And this one even has a center section here that will give you that 5th layer onto your project. And so you can use really paint or any sort of medium for this. So for this demonstration, I'm going to be using Distress ink. They dry very quickly, which allows us to move on and add layers and layers and layers. But you can very easily use acrylic paint or any other medium to add color to these images. And I'm going to be using just 110-pound white cardstock for this. I'm just going to start by just adding the first layer of the stencil. Each of these stencils has a number on them. So this one has a very small etched 1 in the corner. It's probably very hard to see on camera, but it is there. And so I'm just going to add a piece of washi tape just to hold my stencil in place. There are sprays and other things you can use to attach your stencil, but this usually works fine for me. And so I'm going to start with Worn Lipstick Distress ink. Because you want to start with your lightest color first. That is part of the way you're going to get these really beautiful detailed images. I'm using a Tim Holtz domed phone with a mini ink blending tool just to add the color onto the surface. And I'm not being super even with my pressure, which is why you're seeing variation in the flower. But I don't mind that, just because the fact that most flowers, as the light hits it, will have different dark and light areas. You don't have to use necessarily the Tim Holtz one for this. Really, any sort of ink blending tool will work for this. And if you're looking for the supply list, there is a supply list in the description below. That does include affiliate links, but that's just another way you can support this channel so I can keep bringing you videos every week. And so that's a little uneven, but I don't mind the fact that's uneven, just because I'm going to add additional layers of color on top. So now I'm going to pull up this stencil and grab the number 2 stencil. And they all are marked. And also by being aware where the number is on it. So for example, if you wanted to flip it upside down or change the angle, be very aware where this number is, because that's going to tell you which way is up or down on the stencil. And so you'll notice that it doesn't cover the entire thing. It doesn't have a perfect outline. But what it does do is on this bottom corner here, along here, and then just right there, that tells you where that stencil needs to fall onto your image. And then just add your washi tape on top again. And I'm going to use Picked Raspberry for my next color. And now we're just adding another layer onto our surface. And you can decide to go quite light or quite dark, depending on how hard you press and how much ink is on your application tool. And you don't want to press too hard, because these will move a little bit, and because they are quite fragile. So you do need to be quite careful when you use this. And that's part of the reason I also use ink, because I find if I want to try to get the paint off my stencils, it can sometimes require a little bit of rubbing. And with so many little fragile spots on the stencil, I'm a little bit worried about overdoing it and damaging the stencil. Just be careful not to push the stencil as you're doing this. And so what I often do is just put my finger close to a place that might bend, and then that way I'm making sure that I get really good coverage and I don't damage what I'm doing here. And at other times too, you may need to swipe towards the direction that you're going, or just tap very gently, just so that you don't upset the stencil and you don't end up with marks that you don't want. And I think closer to the center, I want it a little bit darker. So I'm just going to add a little bit of extra ink to those spots closer to the center. So now we're going to pull that off. So you can see that now by adding that second layer, you have a lot more color. and a lot more variation in your color. So it's really quite beautiful. And you can see some spots where it was darker or lighter, but that actually adds to a little bit of the charm of these, because as the light hits it, it's not always going to be the same color. And so now the third one, what's good about it is you have a couple spots you can line up again. So you have along the side here, along the bottom, and right in here. So that's a way that you can make sure that you're lined up correctly and make sure that your stencil's in the right place. Because sometimes if you add this other one over top, you'll notice that these two stencils, as much as they're square, they are not lined up exactly. So you really do need to look at each layer and just understand exactly where it fits and finding those reference points just to help you out. And now I'm going to move to Festive Berries. So this is another ink color that I have. We're moving more towards the reds now. I don't have a ton of pinks just because I don't use a ton of pink ink in most of my projects. You can mix pinks and reds, and as long as you're doing nice light layers, the colors beneath are going to affect the color on top. So it will look reddish, but it's not going to look completely red because of the pink that's coming up below. Like you can see here, because I'm not going on super hard, those colors just blend together and just add a little bit of variation over being super pink or super red. So now when you pull that up, you can see now we're getting into some very different color. And so now with this one's a bit of a hard one, just because this is the fourth one, but there are 3 points that you do get an outline and a reference for. So right here, and right here. And then actually this one in there as well. And so then that way you can figure out where your stencil should sit. And now you can just tape it in place again. And the last color that I'll be using is Barn Door. And this is going to go on, again, a little bit darker. And I'm rubbing a bit harder in those spots. They're pretty tiny, so you can go in those circular motions, or you can just tap in whatever makes the most sense with your blending tool. Because these places are pretty small. You just want to try to get as much color in there so that you get a lot of variation and that contrast in that image. And with that one, I'm pulling out just because I don't want to wreck these little edges on that stencil. So you can see now that I've pulled that up, that has a lot of contrast. It has like a lot of really great color. And then to finish this off, I'm going to switch to Wild Honey. That's another yellow that I have here. And I'm going to just add that little touch of color in the center. I might choose to use a paint pen at a later point just to add in maybe some gold or something, just to add a little bit more contrast here. But for now, this will work. And that's that little fifth layer that comes separately here. And so you can see that you end up with a very, very vivid, very layered, extremely contrasting flower. I also did this in another set of colors. And these ones here, which were just as beautiful, were done using squeezed lemonade, mustard seed, wild honey, and spiced marmalade. And again, if you're looking for any of these color combinations, I do include them all below in the supply list, along with everything that I've used today. And so that's one way you can do these beautiful layered images and just add so much variation to your creative project. So what if you love this, but you don't necessarily want to buy all these new stencils? Then you can try to use something that's already in your stencil collection. And so this is a stencil that I made using my brother's Scan and Cut, just with a piece of cardstock and just choosing some hexagon images. So I have a really good result with adding layers and layers and layers on one image. It's important to start with a very large image. Usually I start with circles or this hexagon shape. What you want is a larger stencil so that you can add other details inside of it and still have it work really well in your creative projects. So I'm going to start by adding a little bit of Speckled Egg Distress Oxide ink. So I moved to the oxides because they're a bit more opaque and I kind of want a little bit more intensity of color on this page. So basically just want to add a layer of ink onto your surface. And this is where you could really use spray paint to do this. You could use a variety of different distress sprays, mediums, whatever you want to do for these layers. In this case, I am starting with a fairly thin layer just on top. And because I'm using handmade stencil, it's a little less strong than a lot of the ones you will buy. So you just have to be a little bit more careful with how you apply color onto the surface. And I already broke the stencil earlier. I tripped and I managed to break it a little bit. So that's okay. You can just tape them together and just keep working with it. And this stencil maybe took me 5 minutes to make using my brother's Scan and Cut. I used the software that was provided, created some hexagon images, and just lined them up and added them to my page. And just make sure your stencil stays in place. And now we can look at starting to add other textures and other layers on top. And the first layer I'm going to add on top is going to be very subtle. I kind of want a little bit more texture with the speckled egg. So I'm just going to go in and add just another layer of speckled egg over top through the stencil. This is meant to give just very subtle texture. It's not meant to look very bold. So this way I've just added a little bit of texture onto the images. And you'll see if I pull this back, basically they're still within the hexagon shapes. So I still want to stick with a little bit more of a subtle background. This is going to be part of a journal page we're going to create with those flowers that I've already done. And so in this case, I'm just going to add in a darker color, which in this case I'm using Broken China, on top of the surface. Basically just adding another really interesting layer. And again, you don't necessarily have to do everything the same level of intensity or even cover the blocks in the same way. So I'm going to have really intense corner here. I'm going to have something lighter there. And this is a Stamperia stencil. And if you want to see the entire supply list, just check out the description below. I include all of the stencils and everything I use in that supply list. And if you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, if you could like it, subscribe, and just hit the notification button so you don't miss on any future videos. And I just thank you so much for your support. Every time you like a video, that just helps more people see it. And if you have any comments about what I've shared so far, just please leave a comment below. I love talking with you guys and hearing more about what you think about the techniques or some of the thoughts you have on how you would change it in your own creative practice. I always enjoy the conversations that I have with you all online. And so from here, then the question is, do you want to add another stencil on top? Do you want to add another color? In this case, I'm adding a little bit of shaded lilac. I still want to try to keep everything really light on this particular page. And this is another way you can kind of mix things up, is you could leave this stencil on top and then even add another stencil on top of it. And then what that will do is the pattern below will resist certain areas of the stencil that you're putting on top. This works a lot better when you have larger, medium, and smaller stencils, but I want to try to show it to you just through here, just so you can get the idea of where you can go with this. And so you can see only the tiny bits of the text have come through because this was covering it. If I want this to be more bold, what I would do is just basically add the writing right through the stencil. And so this is where you could really have a lot of detail. Like, for example, if I had left just the circle stencil on and not done anything on top of it, within those circles, I could have added the text, and the text would have only been on the circular area. And so this is a way you can almost create resists as you're stenciling. And even just putting the stencil down and leaving it here is a resist, so that it does protect areas of the background, but then you can add other color on top. So there's lots of options. You don't have to stick to just one thing. It's just being aware of just how you can layer these stencils. So I'm going to continue on and just add a little bit more color through these stencils onto these hexagons. And in this case, I'm not going to go nearly as dark. If I had done this again, I would probably actually have done this one first and then added in the flourishes over top, because this is a lot more solid pattern. So you want to think this through. You want to think about which is the biggest pattern, the mid pattern, and the small pattern. Often when I've been in doodling classes, we call it Papa, Mama, Baby. And so the idea that you have like the Papa size stencil, which is the big one, the Mama, which is a bit smaller, and then the Baby, which is all those lovely little details. So depending on what you're trying to do, that's a way that you can really create a lot of interest to your stenciled images and create these layers. It's not going to be the same as those very detailed floral stencils, but it does give you some options for just creating something that's really unique and stays within a shape. And so I'm just going to come and just add a bit more text on top here. I'm just not going to add it everywhere, but I do like the text stencils because they add a little bit of interest to my page. And if I was going to do this again, I don't think I would use just straight ink. I would probably use a combination of inks, paints, and maybe even spray paints, because then that's another way you can add a lot of dimension to your surface. But in this case, because I already had a focal image in mind, and I didn't want to go too crazy with adding too much bold design, this is a way of just adding something to your background and just having it be just a really nice bit of subtle texture to complement what you're already doing. So I've arranged my peonies onto the page, and what I was really trying to go with this is to make this look like a lattice. So what I've realized, I need to go in with a little bit of pen and ink and just try to get a little bit of those lines, and then maybe just add a few leaves or whatever just to try to bring this together to give us a little bit more presence. So my placer pen, and I'm just going to outline these images. And this is a fountain pen with permanent ink in it. Placer ones don't necessarily come with permanent ink, but I was able to find some cartridges, and because this one is fairly easy to clean, it's kind of one of my choices when I'm using this on surfaces like watercolor paper, where you might run into issues with your other pens with the nib getting fibers in it. The nice thing about a fountain pen is you don't have to worry about that. So it was just a matter of figuring out what pen I could get that would have ink that would work. And I like using this a lot in my pen and ink drawing, just because then I don't have to worry about always having permanent ink or worrying about wrecking my pens. So to give this more of a feel like it is a lattice, because most lattices aren't always white, or even if they're white, they have areas that are a little bit off color or whatever. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using this stencil as a texture stencil, and the color I'm using is quite light, so even if I'm outside the lines a little bit, it should be fine. And so this is pumice stone, and that's going to give it more of a feel of being an actual trellis with sky kind of peeking through it. And I think by adding in a few vines and adding in a few other shapes to this, this is also going to help give that kind of feel. But you can see how your stencils can be just added as creating custom texture to your page. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a ton of different designs, or it doesn't always have to be like super strong. It can just be very subtle, and it can just add that little bit of interest to your page that you might just really need just to help finish it off. And I think the best way to go about this is I'm going to add in my floral images, and then I'm going to add in vines and other things around it just to try to help this along a little bit, just to kind of give it the look that I'm hoping for. I'm just trying to decide if I want things a bit higher up or if that's going to look like it's floating. I know that peonies don't vine, but I'm taking a little bit of license with this one and being able to try to make it into something maybe a little bit different. And maybe I will put one up higher. And I think as long as I have something connecting them, it is going to look good. So I've actually used a paper cutter just to cut along the edge here. You could really just glue everything on and try to cut it later. Sometimes if you cut it afterwards, it can be a little hard to get a really nice clean line. So I'm just going to go straight to cutting it first and just adjusting as I go. I'm basically just adding some of this glitter art glue. I find that I like using this particular glue. It's very good, has a nice tip. It works really well. It dries clear, so it's really great for these types of layouts. So even if you do go over, you're not going to notice the glue. So I wanted to group these fairly close together because often flowers, you don't always see every flower individually. You see them more as a group, and that's kind of how they end up sitting in a flower bed. So I wanted to add my sediment before I start adding other things around it, because I want to make sure that I have room for what I want to add to my page. If you're using a stamp pad, you want to make sure you put on everything backwards. Otherwise, it's all going to be backwards when you go to print it. And what I'm putting is what you focus on will bloom. And this is a little bit of the idea of like what you pay attention to will grow. I'm just taking a little bit of a different thought on it because I really wanted to have something related to the flowers for this page. And I'm basically stamping this with Archival Ink. I'm not sure how well it's actually going to stamp onto the watercolor paper, so my intention is to almost use it more as a black outline, and then I will go in with some paint pen or something else later and just add in with a little bit more strength what I want on this. But this gives you an idea of what text I want to use and the placement of it. Yeah, so you can see it didn't really take into the watercolor very well, but that's okay. I'm not really worried about that. That just gives me an outline. Why I was thinking what you focus on will bloom is just thinking about our lives and about what we do and what we focus on. And I know for myself, the more I focus on the things that I care about, the things that are really important to me, the more encouraged I am, the more excited I am, the more I'm willing to work on things. I'm working a lot more on my YouTube channel, on my art, on a lot of things in my life this year. And what I'm finding is, instead of just saying about all the things that I want to do, it's like, am I going to focus on it so that it will grow and bloom? Or am I going to sit thinking that, well, it'll happen eventually? Because it's not going to happen on its own. It's only going to happen depending on the amount of effort I put into it. And so I was really thinking about the idea of that effort and figuring out, well, what do I want? What do I really want from life? What's really important to me? And if those things are really important to me, then I'm going to put some time into them. Whatever you put the effort in is going to really make that difference in your life. That's going to change basically how you end up looking at life and how you end up looking at your goals and the things that are important to you. But also what you focus on will bloom will also be like, if you focus on the negative, if you focus on the things that are not good in your life, or you focus on the things you wish were different. What I've realized is hoping that they'll change isn't going to help anything. What I have to do is have to focus on the positive things. What are going to be the habits? What are going to be the things that are going to help me get to where I want to be? And how am I going to show self-care to myself? How am I going to believe that I can make it? And from that, the results come. And I think sometimes we can be harsh on ourselves, or we can show ourselves not a lot of compassion. And I think it's important that we show that compassion to ourselves, that we focus on the things that are going to help us instead of worrying so much about the things that maybe aren't going according to plan. I really wanted to use this layout as a chance to talk about the idea of like, what you focus on will bloom. It's the things that are important to you that are really going to make a difference in the end, and really taking that time to decide, like, what do you want? I've been thinking a lot about that as fall has been coming. Like, what do I want the next 3-4 months to look like? What am I willing to focus on, and what am I going to make grow during this time? And what am I going to work on? Am I going to work on my health? I'm going to work on my self-care. Am I going to paint some paintings? Am I going to do some new projects? Like, where do I want my YouTube channel to go? Like, all of these things have really been that focus of what do I want next? And I really hope that you'll take some time to figure out what that focus is for you and how you can show yourself that self-care as you're figuring out how to focus on the things that are going to make your life better. So I'm just going to add in a few leaves. I don't want this to feel like it's floating in space at all. And again, I'm only doing very simple leaf shapes. I am not doing anything overly complex. So the hard thing with doodling is knowing when to stop and how far to go. And I think I've gone a little far with this. I ended up putting a lot more doodles on than I expected, but you know what? Why not? Why not just mix it up and try something a little differently? So at this point, I'm just basically adding in some paint colors, and I'm going to add some paint onto these leaves and on these little cursive flourishes, and then see kind of where I end up. And I'm using paint just because I have so many layers going on here. I need to be able to pull them out a bit and have them differentiate a little bit from the background. So I'm starting with some grass green here, and I can always add in my color back in my lines again. If it ends up being that I need to, it's not a big deal. And actually, if I put it on the paint thin enough, you can just cover up the black, and it just makes it a little bit more subtle, but it's still there. Adding in a little bit of the phthalo while I'm at it. That phthalo is quite strong, so I've gone on a little dark. I'll just go back and forth until I get the look that I want. And the trick to this is trying to stay off of the edges of the flowers. I haven't done a great job with that. It's not that noticeable, and it'll be fine. And using fluid acrylics, they're a little bit thinner, so this is why they're not overtaking the background. I think it's a hunter green that I'm applying at the moment. Most of the peony leaves are quite dark and glossy. I'm using a small paintbrush with this one because I am trying to have a little bit more control. Adding some grass green in some places, brighten up those leaves a little bit. So now I have a good amount of color down, but it's a little bit dark. So I'm going to just go in and just add some highlights. And with this one for the cursive bits, I am just going to go in with a pen and just add in a little bit more color. This one I'm doing in teal just to bring a little bit of the green and the blue together. And there we go. And that's a little bit busier than I thought. I should maybe just left off some of the cursive in there, but I feel like the rest of it's really good. But maybe I do like the cursive as well too. So you know what? You always end up playing with things, adding things, and seeing what happens. But I'm really glad I added the leaves and kind of brought in a sense of presence with this. Because now I feel like the flowers, they're looking like they're being really layered. This looks like a very deep project, and I'm really glad for that look to it. So you can see that just by using texture and stencils and just layering things, you can end up with a really beautiful art journaling page. So I know we've covered a lot of different techniques today about how you can layer stencils and add multiple layers of stencils to create one beautiful image. And whether or not you're going and getting a set of stencils that already come with all the layers in it, or you're just using something from your collection, it shows us the versatility of stencils and how we can use them in our creative practice. And if you have any questions about today's video, just leave a comment below. I would love to start a conversation with you about what I've shared today, and I hope this video has been helpful for you. And if you are interested in any of the supplies, because I know I've gone over a lot of different supplies today, just check out the description below. That includes all the supplies I've used. There's also affiliate links in there, which means that I do get a small commission at no additional cost to you, but it's a really great way you can support this channel. If you're looking for another video about how to use stencils in your creative practice, click here. This one I go over how to use stencils with a gel plate and the ways you can create beautiful images for your art journal. So I'll see you in the next video.